Thank you, Sasha, and thanks, Anne. I'm really delighted to be here and to help facilitate this mass interconnection that 19V is turning out to be. Before we move to the main event, I wanted to make a couple of announcements. First of all, a few general details about the seminar series that is hereby beginning. The plan is to meet approximately every 2 weeks, and so far we've got events scheduled through the summer and the fall. Some info on upcoming events appears in the Jordan Center announcements that most of you have been receiving, as well as on their website, and more details will be available as we move forward. So if you would like to present, you can send me an email with your proposal. My email address is on the master list of 19V participants, our ever-growing Google document. And I bring that up because it's an important document. It's actually at the heart of one of 19V's objectives, which is enabling people with common interests to find one another. So I highly recommend that you take a look at it from time to time. And if you have lost it, I know from personal experience, you can dig it up again by looking at one of the last few Jordan Center email announcements, since these include a link to the sign-up sheet. Or you can find the same announcements by simply Googling 19V and NYU Jordan Center. And let me also reiterate what Anne Lounsbury wrote in an email the other day, which is that to become a member of 19V, all you have to do is add your name to that document. And to be a part of a 19V initiative, you can either start one yourself, and again, the 19V sign-up list is a fantastic resource for finding people to start subgroups with, or you can join an initiative that already exists. This will get a little bit easier within a week or so, I hope, when 19V will have its own landing page on the website of the Jordan Center. That will be a stable place where we'll be able to list and therefore also to find details about 19V and 19V events and subgroups and other initiatives. As for the shape of the events, these seminars can and should take a variety of forms. These could range from talks by individuals on new research to events involving 2 or more speakers, such as tonight's roundtable. So if you were to start a subgroup on, say, Russian Orientalism or the history of photography, you might think about proposing an event for the seminar series that would showcase your initiative in some way, maybe with 2 or 3, 4 people, I don't know, that would be wonderful. And let me also reiterate that yes, presentations in Russian are of course welcome too. I also wanted to mention that for events involving a single speaker, we are planning to add собеседники. The собеседник will be someone in addition to the speaker who will comment briefly on the talk in a general way and use his or her expertise to help frame the speaker's talk in terms of larger 19V questions by drawing out significant themes, for example, or by indicating how the talk might be linked to pressing or to unexplored issues in the field and so on. So next Wednesday, for example, on July 1st, we'll have Allison Lee from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. She'll be speaking on painting and masculinity. Her title is Alexander Ivanov, Painting, Desire, and the 19th Century Male Nude. And her собеседник will be Molly Brunson from Yale. So I hope you'll be able to come next week for that. In the meantime, now let's focus on what is the 19th century. The idea behind this roundtable was to bring a few people together from different disciplines and ask them to address some of the big questions facing the field. Specifically, we have a historian, an art historian, and a literary scholar, and they have each been asked to think about the following questions, or at least to use them as a point of departure. Here they are. When does the 19th century begin, and when does it end? Where can or should we draw lines or perhaps erase them between centuries? What are the defining moments, watersheds, or turning points in your discipline? And also, and perhaps as a question for all of us, do the answers to such questions vary for different disciplines? Is there really a single 19th century, or are there perhaps multiple and overlapping versions of it? These are obviously questions that many of us grapple with in different practical ways when we define research projects or write grants or court publishers or appease university administrators. And also, of course, as teachers when we define the scope of our courses. But the point of this event is also to appreciate the less practical aspects of these questions, I hope, and to enjoy the sheer intellectual pleasure of thinking about ontologies and the repercussions and what kinds of bracketing or packaging may or may not work in a given context. and what the limits might be of a given system that we choose to employ. Our first speaker, Alex Martin, a historian from Notre Dame University, is actually here representing implicitly or perhaps spiritually an entire panel on how to define the 19th century that was held last year at the ACES convention in San Francisco. Word has it that this panel was extremely engaging, and it had an enormous influence on the formation of this 19V working group. So we even thought briefly about trying to reproduce the entire panel here, but decided instead that we should go with something a little bit more interdisciplinary in keeping with the spirit of 19V. So what we have are 3 speakers from 3 different disciplines, all of whose work moves between at least 2 and sometimes 3 different centuries. After Alex Martin, our second speaker is Rosalind Polly Blakesley, an art historian from Cambridge, and our third speaker is Luba Golburt, a literature specialist from Berkeley. Let me remind you that there will be plenty of time for questions again, so if you'd like to comment or ask a question, you can just write comment or question in the chat, and we'll make sure to take the questions in order. So without further ado, I will now turn the floor over to Alex Martin.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. I tried to dig up my notes from the roundtable, but I only found some of them. So these are partly old ideas and partly new ideas I've had since then. But so the question that the other panelists and I were asked to reflect on was partly at least what is the 19th century? Where does it start? Where does it end? And on that score, among historians, there's absolutely no consensus, right? People date the 19th century all over the place. I think the difficulty we have in Russian history in dating the 19th century, or the way we date it, is it starts, I think, when the Petrine, the aftermath of the Petrine era has run its course, which means some people put it at 1796, some put it at 1801, some put it at 1825. I've seen one Russian historian who said it really ends at 1861, right? So by that logic, the 19th century doesn't even start until 1861, because that's when the aftershocks of the Petrine era have finally ended. From the other end, I think we end the 19th century when the 1917 revolution comes into view. And depending on your preference, that could be 1917, it could be 1905, it could be the accession of Nicholas II. I'm guessing you could do it in 1881. So what you can see is essentially the Russian 19th century gets squeezed from both directions by a long 18th century on the one hand, and on the other hand, by a 20th century that comes into view fairly early. Now, the problem that we have, it seems to me, is that the 19th century is a historical era that fits very organically into European and US history. As what you have in Europe and the United States, and I want to pause on that for a moment, what you have there is a distinct era that runs from the American and French revolutions to the First World War, which I suppose you could call that modernity 1.0. That basically the old regime has been overthrown, and there's an attempt to create a modern system. So you have a shift from an agricultural to an industrial economy, from a monarchical political system to a system of national states with popular sovereignty, a shift from serfdom or slavery to free labor, a shift from a society of estates to a society of classes, from a state religion to individual religious freedom, from localism to centralized bureaucratic states. All of that happens in the aftermath of the revolutions. And there's a first version of this that gets created in the 19th century, which is basically 19th century liberal bourgeois society. And this survives until the First World War, and then gets profoundly transformed and becomes the second version of modernity, which is more or less what we live with today. So I think the 19th century as an era, the reason it would make sense to think of it as one is because of this West European and North American pattern. And the trouble is that this doesn't fit Russia. And the reason it doesn't fit Russia is I think because of the point that, I remember Mark Ryev made it very effectively in his book on the well-ordered police state. I don't think he invented it, but he made this argument effectively, that basically and here I'm departing from Ryev for a moment, what you have in the West with the revolutions is a highly structured old regime society And the goal of the revolutions is to dismantle this highly structured old regime society and liberate society from those constraints. The Russians, of course, didn't have this structured old regime to begin with. What you had in Russia was a fairly amorphous society. And so the whole thrust of the 18th century reforms was to create structure, and to create structure by creating a European old regime. And so in Russia, the creation of a European old regime continues until the middle of the 19th century. So clearly by the 1840s, Russia is still creating structures that are designed to produce the kind of social system that Western countries began dismantling at the time of the late 18th century revolutions. The Russians begin to dismantle this only after 1861. And then they really haven't dismantled it even by 1917, right? The Sokovia system survives until 1917. The autocracy survives until 1905. So in a sense, the 19th century as a post-old regime era doesn't exist in Russia at all. So where that leaves us, I think, for the 19th century is either we can argue that Russia doesn't have a 19th century, that they basically segue straight from the 18th century to the 20th with no transition. Or I think maybe a better way to think of it is that Russia in the 19th century, what characterizes the 19th century, and I'm not going to try to put dates on it, because I don't think you can date really a beginning and an end to this. What characterizes the 19th century is, in a way, the coexistence of different eras. That on the one hand, there is an 18th century social and political structure that survives intact until 1861 and in substantial ways after that. But at the same time, Russia's foreign competitors were modern Western bourgeois societies. So Russian leaders and Russian public opinion were continually looking to modern societies for ideas and inspiration. And secondly, that Russian intellectual culture was part of the modern Western intellectual culture. So you basically have modern political leaders and modern intellectuals in an essentially 18th century society. So the consequence then is that Russian social, I think you especially see the effects of this in Russian social and political thinking, which is, and what happens there is that Russians think about their old regime society in light of the modern experience of the West and of the modern ideas that they themselves are part of. And that combination of modern thinking in an old regime society does not exist anywhere in the West. It's a specifically Russian phenomenon. As a consequence of that confluence of these two things, the old regime society and the modern ideas, Russians, or the Russian elites, the people who shape the direction of Russian society, make certain kinds of choices in the 19th century about which pieces of the old regime to keep, which ones to discard, what shape a modern Russia should have. And they make choices in the 19th century that decisively shape the subsequent development of the society. I'd like to give you just 3 examples of that. One is, if you look at in the area of cultural development, what happens as Russia goes from having a narrow elite culture to a much broader literate culture is the Russian educated classes develop a cultural model that's based on a national culture that fuses the westernized culture of the elite with the traditional culture of the folk. So for example, they repudiate the cultural cosmopolitanism of the 18th century. They also don't go for the kind of middle-class culture that becomes dominant, say, in the United States. But there's a particular vision of culture that comes out of being an old regime society, but having modern thinkers. Or as a second example, a second big choice that gets made is in favor of a strong state, as against a weaker, more decentralized, more liberal state. If you went back to the era of Catherine the Great had a strong monarchy, but created very strong institutions of local society. So you could imagine a path from there that could lead to a much more decentralized society. But in the 19th century, that path was not taken. Or as a third example, If you look at the development of the economic thinking of the Russian elites, the Russian elites observed the revolution in France. You see how noble power of the peasants in France ended with revolution. They observed how noble power over the peasants in Prussia ended largely with the dispossession of the peasants and the nobles keeping all the land. And in response to that, what develops in Russia is a paternalistic understanding of the economy that says that the economy should be a hierarchical order with communal structures for the common people under the control of some higher authority. And that is a model, that's the model that is implemented in the Emancipation in 1861, and that becomes a feature of modern Russian economic life. So I think, and I think I'm pretty much out of my 10 minutes, so I'm going to wrap it up on this note. But I think if I had to define what the 19th century in Russia is all about, the central feature of it, in my view, is this coinciding in time of an essentially 18th century old regime social and political system with a modern intellectual culture and a modern set of preoccupations among the political elites. Thank you.
Is it allowed to comment?
No, if you want to comment, please write a comment in the chat and we'll come to you at the end of all three presentations.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was extremely interesting. Our next speaker is Polly Blakesley from Cambridge. So, Polly, please, you need to unmute your microphone first. Polly, you're muted.
Right, I think
There
I'm
you go.
unmuted now, yeah?
Yep.
Can people see my PowerPoint okay? Sarah, can you let me know?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Alex, thank you very much for that. An awful lot of fascinating ideas there. I thought I'd start on a slightly flippant note, which is to say that in many respects, Russia lends itself very well to the study of centuries in the modern era, with rulers very obligingly taking up cudgels and founding cities, fending off revolt, or ending their days around a fin de siècle. How convenient of Peter the Great to establish St. Petersburg in 1703, of Catherine to die in 1796, and of Paul to meet his end in 1801, ensuring that a new century coincided with a new reign. I could go on. Alexander III succumbs to nephritis in 1894. The 1905 revolution augurs the turmoil of the 20th century. Even Putin plays ball by being appointed acting prime minister of the Russian Federation in, of course, 1999. But to move away from such flippancy, these coincidences are as unhelpful as they are convenient, obfuscating the myriad narratives, developments, and trajectories that cannot be neatly marshaled into this or that century. And many scholars of Russia's modern history rightly pivot their work around other landmark events, some of which Alex has alluded to. So we might mention the Manifesto on the Freedom of the Nobility, the Decembrist Uprising, the emancipation of the serfs, the assassination of Alexander II. And I've noted that the cross-century periodization of 1762 to 1825 has acquired particular currency. In Thomas Barron's Russia Reads Rousseau, Janet Hartley's book on military power, and Andreas Schönler and Andrei Zorin's collaborative project on the self-invention of the Russian elite, which resulted in these two publications. All fascinating books with absolutely terrible covers. What then are the questions of periodization for the historian of Russian art, and the pitfalls and potential of the 19th century as a defining structure for their work? Now, the century can undoubtedly provide a rational frame, if we like, for art historical work. Following Catherine the Great's dynamic patronage, Russian artists in some respects hit their stride as the 19th century dawned. In 1801, Paul commissioned monumental canvases on episodes from Russian history for his newly completed Mikhailovsky Zamek, injecting energy into Russian history painting. Landscape painting, sorry, for some reason, I can't move forward. There we go. Landscape painting as an independent genre was propelled by Alexeyev's views of Moscow, and the vibrancy of Russian portraiture was attested by works as stately as Borovikovsky's portrait of Alexander Kurakin. The other end of the century is equally well bookended. By the 1890s, the Periodvishniki were seen to be losing their edge, hemorrhaging artists as significant as Repin to the newly reformed academy. In 1898, Diaghilev, seen here in Serov's great work, and his colleagues formed the Mir Iskustva Journal and Exhibition Society to prioritize avowedly aesthetic sensibilities and tastes, and the modernist exuberance of artists such as Vrubel and Serov came to the fore in works such as Demon Seated of 1890 and Serov's impressionistic portrait of Mika Morozov of 1901. This supposed triumph of modernism was seen to culminate in Serov's award of the Grand Médaille d'Honneur for his portrait of Grand Duke Pavel Alexandrovich at the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1900. But this painting gives us pause to consider ways in which the framing device of the 19th century has at best privileged certain narratives over others, and at worst skewed the art historical record entirely. In the first place, the 19th century model has served to perpetuate a story of Russian painting as an inexorable drive from the neoclassical ideals of the academy via the critical realism of the Periodvishniki towards a modernist apotheosis exemplified by the more outre works of Serov and even more so the early works of the avant-garde. But how, in this genealogy, would we account for a work such as Kiprensky's portrait of his foster father, painted just 2 years after Borovikovsky's portrait of Kurakin, but surely delving into painterly concerns just as keenly as Serov's work, albeit in a very different way? Equally, how do we count for this painting, by a long-standing research interest of mine, the British artist Emily Shanks, who was the first woman to be elected a member of the Periodvishniki. She was in fact elected in 1894, another unfortunate date near a fin de siècle, and that was the same year that Serov was elected, and I would like to say that Shanks got 15 votes to Serov's 14. To be sure, Shanks's painting evinces a sentimentality which is not unusual in the work of many Periodvishniki by this stage, but its attention to painterly process, evident in the looseness of the brushwork and the fragmented form, suggests that the Periodvishniki were far more open to supposedly modernist practices than typical histories of 19th century painting might assume. It's taken dogged work to excavate Shanks's career, despite the fact that she exhibited at no less than 19 of the 25 Periodvishnik exhibitions held from 1891 to 1915. It's an amazingly long run of involvement. This brings me to a second concern with the 19th century as a framing device for Russian art, namely its persistent recourse to the achievements of great men. I have to say the shade of Thomas Carlyle looms very heavy here. Only in the 20th century we're led to believe were there women artists truly worthy of critical attention. I'm particularly thoughtful about this as I embark on my next major research project, which aims to examine Russia's artistic engagement in the Baltic region throughout the Imperial period and consider whether a specific Russian Baltic artistic modernity might have existed, perhaps alongside but distinct from other better known models of modernity which have dominated arts histories. In embarking on this more comparative work, I'm struck by the fact that the region's academies, founded in the mid-18th century, admitted women when the 19th century was in full swing, with women's schools at the Swedish Academy in 1864, followed by their Russian and Danish counterparts in 1873 and 1888. This was significantly earlier than women artists were admitted to the better-known art academies of London and Paris, a fact of enormous significance that has been lost in the mid-ocean of 19th century art. This leads me to wonder about other ways in which the century model has prioritized, for example, white narratives, male narratives, or heteronormative narratives. In rethinking the boundaries of centuries, how then might we write alternative histories? What are the alternative periodizations we might explore? Not least to continue with the still urgent work to recognize and interrogate the roles, achievements, experiences, the sheer agency of women and other marginalized groups. Now, the model of the long 19th century continues to offer much, as does a short 19th century, which is something I used in my first book on Russian genre painting, and which Alison Lee deploys in her excellent Picturing Russia's Men, which is out in a few weeks' time, and a shout out for Alison's seminar this time, I think, next week. But I also wonder if we should attend more rigorously to the conceptual and theoretical parameters and potential of what, for want of a better phrase, I would like to call the syncopated century, a century out of step with the calendar century, which starts perhaps at roughly the calendar century's midpoint. Such a syncopated century is useful to Russian art history. It has the potential to frame, for example, the period from 1764, when Catherine the Great gave the Academy of Arts, seen here, its first statutes, to that institution's first major descent with the Revolt of the 14 in 1763. The syncopated century can also deftly address some of the misapprehensions that have beleaguered histories of Russian art, not least that the Revolt of the 14 led seamlessly to the Periodization, and that these two, in fact, very separate initiatives should be always considered together. Finally, a syncopated century, which starts in the mid-19th century, sorry, I'll move on, could reveal continuities and affinities between the Periodization here and supposedly modernist groups, which would allow space, say, to contextualize and problematize Shanks's work. So might it be that we need to syncopate a bit more rather than always keeping the accent on the stronger beat? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Polly, for that extremely fascinating and provocative talk. So now let's turn to Luba Golburt from Berkeley.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Also a pleasure to be the last speaker on this panel, because I think it's interesting to think about these two different models that Alex and Polly have given us, and whether or not and how they might be applicable to literary studies. Signaled perhaps by the shorthand in the name of this group, 19V, is the recognition that the 19th century is, on the one hand, the bread and butter of Russian studies, particularly perhaps literary studies, and on the other hand, a recognition that we might be at the point of resisting that periodization, that there is maybe a problem with saying the 19th century, so we kind of capture it in this convenient shorthand and then want to re-examine it. What follows is going to be a series of these kinds of meta remarks about this problem. And I want to begin with a by now not particularly polemical assertion that the questions of when the 19th century begins and ends, whether in Russia and particularly in Russian literary culture it is long or short, as well as the periodizing critical procedure from which these kinds of questions arise, are all products of the 19th century, are questions that became conceivable through the concomitant rise in the 19th century of historicism and various culture studying disciplines, particularly literary scholarship and literary history. In this sense, as many critics of periodization since roughly the 1990s have argued, we, the 21st century literary scholars, still live in thrall to powerful and lasting 19th century conceptions of historical transformations as somehow available to description, study, and critique in compartments, right? As, say, romanticism and realism, which are more the categories with which we literary scholars might operate, or as the 19th century. In a recent book on the institutional history of periodization titled why literary periods mattered, note the past tense of this, historical contrast and the prestige of English studies, Ted Underwood summarizes this history as follows, quote, "Through historical contrast, writers defined a sense of collective permanence that could coexist with the radical transformations envisioned by historicism. At the same time, they advanced a model of cultural distinction that thrived on discontinuity and seemed independent of inherited status. In the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, this model of culture was institutionalized in education as a periodized curriculum came to dominate vernacular literary study in colleges and universities," end quote. So I think what Sara brought up in her introduction to the panel, right, the various grants that we write and noting that we're working on the 19th century, is in fact a kind of signal for us to examine a deeper and more interesting ontological meaning that we ascribe to these categories. When we raise these questions of periodization in a new working group dedicated to the study of the 19th century, we must, it seems to me, raise them as meta questions, questions to which we can no longer answer. The 19th century in Russia begins with the failure of the Decembrists and ends with the success of the Bolsheviks, or any such dating exclusively or as a kind of a list. However suggestive and important these datings are, but rather recognize the continuum from the 19th century to our own period attendant upon any such questioning, that we are in a sense living in the paradigms that the 19th century historians, and not only historians, have given us. Now, for literary studies, I want to make a kind of aside and say that I think the appeal to a century is a kind of concession to history and historians. I think this idea, maybe not as polemically framed, was there in Polly's presentation, where she talked about the syncopated century, the century that does not align itself with the chronological century, right? Well, the idea of the syncopated century, of course, also allows us to question the efficacy of the century as a category, right? And on the other hand, to think about how style has become a kind of temporalizing category rather than something else, right? That we assign certain styles to certain periods, right? And then sort of stop thinking about them altogether. There are all sorts of problems with periodization that recent scholars have formulated quite radically and polemically. I want to give you a quick rundown of some memorable quotes. Virginia Jackson, in her introduction to this volume, collected volume on periodization and its discontents, says, "Literary periods allow us to write literary history, but do they keep us from thinking about literary history?" Right? How can we examine the abstraction of literary historical periods without allowing our own thought to become similarly abstract? Robert Rader, period terms do our thinking for us. Gerald Graff, periods erase history. Carolyn Levine, at their best, literary and historical periods look like leaky containers. So what do we do with this kind of a critique? Can we somehow use that critique and still work within the framework of a 19V group, right? Or think about the 19th century as a meaningful place for us to all congregate? As I've suggested, part of it, I think, is recognizing that that's what we're doing, right? That this is the institutional framework in which we all exist. These are the kinds of courses we teach, but also to recognize the problems that this kind of framing this kind of rendering of a chronological period into a hypostasized and personified abstract entity results in, right? And in the Russian case, in the case of the Russian literary 19th century, the hypostasized entity is often wears a sizable beard and writes sizable novels. So this is perhaps something for us to think about, right? Is this the century that we are still grappling with, right? And is the novel century the one that we are still resisting? So I wanted to I wanted to do this in a kind of bipartite structure. The first part that you've just heard is a kind of problematizing and meta describing this issue, right, of periodization. And the second part is a set of questions and kind of challenges that maybe I myself face and maybe some of you do too, in terms of our work. So what are some of the ideas that have been offered to counter the sway of centuries as periodizing frameworks? By now we're all familiar, it's also become a kind of old hat technique with these year-centered or even date-centered conferences and books, which I think were in large part designed to resist the century or movement-based frameworks. They tried to capture the diversity of events, publications, various figures, conversations, etc., that dwell within a much shorter period. So they tried to introduce a finer grain to our discussions. And I think that is still very useful. And that might help us, for example, with problems such as the one that Polly brought up, right, with the kind of enfranchisement of women and so on, right, in our studies. Another question that is perhaps worth thinking about is whether or not something new begins when something old is perceived to end. And I think this is something that Alex very interestingly framed for us, saying that somehow this kind of Western paradigm of modernity, right, both kind of economic and intellectual, arising at a certain period does not work for Russia, where old structures persist even as new ideas are circulate. But it seems to me that the problem is not, or this kind of asynchronicity or coincidence of asynchronous planes is not simply a Russian problem. It seems that asking when does the 18th century end is not the same as asking when does the 19th century begin, right? Something can end continuously while something else has already begun for a while. I think that brings me back to this problem of the 19th, asking about periodization and the 19th century as a meaningful category, as a kind of product of 19th century historicism, right? In a way, for us literary historians, the 19th century has not ended. We're still thinking within the paradigms that the 19th century has offered us. On the other hand, of course, we have lived through the 20th century and we are in the 21st, right? So there is a kind of asynchronicity there, and a kind of coexistence of different eras that is there, not just in the Russian case. Another question that I think many of you in the audience are much better equipped to deal with is that question of the novel, and whether or not the 19th century persists as long as the novel remains a kind of central genre, right? And as long as long totalizing narratives remain central genres, to that end, it might be useful to think about the end of the novel and the discourse of the end of the novel as something that repeats itself throughout the 20th century and perhaps to this day, right? And is echoed by those of us working on novel history. What are some of the solutions, some other solutions to this problem of periodization? I think histories of reading and rereading 19th century figures, texts, and paradigms have worked against this discourse of endings and beginnings. Ideas persist. They keep on living and being re-examined. And so this is one way to maybe erase some of these boundaries. There's also a different material logic of media and communications history, where we are no longer focused on historical categories, on dates, but are thinking about materials. There are problems with that as well. I think digital humanities at their best offer us different versions of thinking, different options for thinking about historical change, different ways to offer more fine gradations to how things happen, especially stylistically, how new ideas get introduced and circulated. As a final comment, I want to also bring up my own current research and the problem that I've been facing and haven't really resolved yet. I'm working on a long book on the Russian nature lyric. And I'm thinking that centuries do not really mean much when one works on history, on poetic histories, on history of poetry or the lyric, in part because, of course, poets themselves do not think historically in the way that we're used to. There's a kind of presentness to poetry of different periods that poetic work implies. So how do we as literary scholars then resist these inherited frames of periodization in talking about the material that seems so successful in resisting those frames? And I'm going to stop at that.
Thank you very much, Luba. That was very interesting, gives us a lot to think about. So what we're going to do now is turn over the floor to questions, or actually not turn over the floor, but move to Sasha, who's going to be going through the messages that she, if I'm not mistaken, Sasha is receiving privately because the group chat is off. Is that right, Sasha?
Yes, that's right. And I'm going to chat with everyone now also.
Okay, so now if you've sent a message to Sasha, you're already on a list to comment or question or raise a question. Otherwise, the group chat is now open and you can sign up that way. Unfortunately, part of what would be really nice at a roundtable is people being able to talk among themselves instead of following this list, but nobody can even see everyone who's here because of the limitations, the visual limitations of Zoom. So we can't really do that. But anyone, if you don't have to, this isn't really intended to grill the speakers necessarily. One could also, present some other ideas about periodization and so on. So, so please, let's hear what you have to say. Sasha.
All right, great. So I believe that the first question that we had was from Kate, for Alex. Is the elite sense of living in an old regime society more about their perception than reality? We've seen how much the Soslovia system was much messier in practice, etc.
Well, first of all, it's an interesting question. And as you might imagine, I don't have any kind of simple answer to it. I think if you think of this as the Russian Soslovia system as a version of a European estate system, the estate systems of 18th century Europe were not neat and orderly either. So people had, there's constant negotiation of which group has what position in relation to which other group, and they're fighting for privileges, and people are trying to shift from one category to another. So I think it was always, I think it's important to not have an image of what a Western old regime would have looked like, that overstates the neatness and orderliness of it. But there is, I think, in 19th century Russia, a sense that the basic structure of society is built around different people having different statuses, and that the issue is negotiating these distinct statuses, as opposed to abolishing the conception of status, of these kinds of statuses, and replacing it with a system, with a conception of social classes, of differentiation purely based on wealth, and that sort of thing. So I think, and if you read Alison Smith's excellent book about the Soslovia system, I think it conveys very strongly that to people fairly far down in the social system, their membership in a local Soslovia community was an essential component of what they saw as being their position in life. So my impression is, this is an interesting question, my impression is that this extends beyond the elites to really the entire society. That's my sense of it.
Okay, thank you, Alex. We had a question from Piotr. If you'd like to unmute yourself, you can go ahead.
Yes, thank you. That was a very interesting panel. So I appreciate that this 19V group is meeting as regularly as it does with such interesting discussions. I have a question, I suppose, to Alex and Luba, because this concerns something that Alex was talking about in terms of the lack of influence from Europe in a certain way, or a disjunction between what was going on in Russia in the 19th century and what was going on in Europe. But to my mind, I think if we consider the history of ideas, I would venture that one way of characterizing the 19th century is to say, at the end of the 18th century, there comes a crisis. It was much earlier that it began, but a crisis in objectivity in philosophy that Kant tries to solve by identifying that the human mind has no access to the thing in itself outside of its own mind, but does have access to its own conception of the thing in itself. And that creates a sort of totalizing, it's part of a system of totalizing knowledge. And for that reason, it can be known, even though it can't be accessed as an external thing. Then later, there are other philosophers like Hegel and Marx who follow in that wake and try to understand the thing in itself as something like self-knowledge. But for Marx, it becomes a way of saving philosophy to talk about the external world and the mind by bridging mind with relation to means of production or material life or something like this, and giving a conception of history. So I think of the 18th or the 19th century as having these moves where Marx identifies something that also saves philosophy and makes it analytically rigorous. And then in a certain way, I think of it as also extending to Freud, even though the interpretation of dreams, it comes out at the end of the 19th century. It's a crisis in subjectivity there. Not only is there no access to the thing in itself objectively, but there's suddenly no access to the unconscious mind. Not really anyway, it can't actually be known. So there's a crisis in the subject as well. And I focus on Dostoevsky, so I think in some ways he wasn't, obviously Dostoevsky was not analytically rigorous in a Marxist way of critiquing class, but The Idiot is a critique of the bourgeoisie and kind of life that's centered around money. Then you have Crime and Punishment, which also precedes Freud, but is a text about a divided self and a self that doesn't entirely know its own motivations. And then just to throw something else in here, Darwin creates a different problem as well in terms of demoting man from a privileged position as a knower because he descends from God to making man, or the human being, someone that descends from animals and is part of the natural order in a way that was not conceived before. And that also influences Dostoevsky with the notion of viper eats viper in Brothers Karamazov. So I'm wondering how, in literature, we understand in Russia these crises in objectivity and subjectivity that were influenced by trends in philosophy of the Western world generally.
You know, it's such a weighty question, Piotr. I think what I tried to propose in my talk is that we understand that thinking about crises is important, but we might not need to understand them primarily as belonging into to a certain ontologized century. So that's one way to kind of meta answer this. Another way is to say that our very notion of crisis, right, is also a kind of problematic one, right? Because it poses a kind of rupture or event, right, as the primary category of for our attention and analysis, rather than the kind of build-up and continued sway, which is, I think, where you are going with your question, right? Because you're thinking of sort of Dostoevsky's response, right? A kind of long-term response, right? A long-term duration of these ideas, right? So I think we might be thinking along the same lines. But whether or not the 19th century as a category helps us with any of that, I don't know, right? I think it's a kind of very popular notion to say the 19th century is the birthplace, right? We've already kind of created an abstract entity there, a birthplace of big totalizing ideas, right? But can we also think in other directions, right? I've also been reading books in this kind of, everything is ecological now, right? And so I've been reading books about these disciplinary ecologies or literary ecologies. And I think there's something helpful in thinking about that, right? In thinking about time periods as these ecological spaces where if we ontologize them, we allow certain species to prosper and survive and others to fall by the wayside and sort of perish, right? So that focus on, Kant, Darwin, Freud, Marx, right? And Dostoevsky, I'm not saying that we shouldn't, right? But what has that narrative left out? Has that narrative left out? It's not necessarily in terms of these disenfranchised categories of writers or artists, right? But conceptually, it also leaves things out.
I realize the question was also directed to me, but I'm wondering if I can toss this over to Polly, because it seems like I wonder whether these same issues would show up in the arts.
Hi, am I unmuted? Yes, yeah. I think it's a great sort of myriad of debates intertwined there. I think in some respects it does map onto what's happening in the visual arts, but in some respects I think there's a real difference there. And one of the things I wanted to bring in thinking about this actually is another question which is in the group chat, which I think is really interesting, where someone is asking, putting it to the three of us, that we looked at the 19th century from the meta position of those with the privilege to look back, and how do we think about recovering different voices and different narratives, which is something which I think feeds into some of what Luba has just been saying. And I found it really interesting how, in terms of, certainly within the art historical field, one of the ways we can begin to do that and problematize some of those binaries which have been thrown out there is, in fact, through sources which are being made available thanks to or via the very institutions which initially instantiated very rigid date marks. So in my case, as an example, I'm thinking about the Academy of Arts, which I've worked on extensively, and you know, which I'm incredibly curious about, because it's always been demonized as the great unhealthy other that, you know, stops artistic creativity in Russia, whereas in fact I think, you know, all sorts of other cases are true. But it's the very academy which has put out there some of the big figures which dominate narratives of supposedly romantic thinking or realist thinking in Russia. So I'm thinking sort of in terms of, you know, romantic painting. They might put out some of the portraiture of Karl Brulov, or the you know, much is made of Ivanov. So it's the academy which has lionized particular figures and led to this, as I was putting it, the sort of the culture of the great men. But at the same time now, the academy is making available by publishing the diaries of very, you know, the sort of the little figures who studied there, which is absolutely fascinating resource material. So it enables us to literally populate in this case, this enormous building where, you know, tens of thousands of artists studied, of whom a few hundred have their names known now. So sorry, I'm segueing, I think, from one question into another, but in ways which I hope are useful. But I'm interested in ways that it's the very institutions that have canonized certain figures and certain dates and certain periods when we think about the 19th century and what it might constitute, which are now perhaps making available material which enable us to unpack that and dismantle those edifices to create a much more sort of polyphonic experience.
Thank you to you both.
Okay. We just got a follow-up question to Shama's question, which you just touched on, Polly. So I'm going to go to that just so we can stay on the same topic. So from Anne, to add to Shama's question, what about our narratives of the 19th century generated in the 20th, and the ways in which notions of persistence and recurrence are projected on our understanding of the past? I'm put in mind of some kind of opposition between Vasilovsky's persistent forms and Tikhonov's regimes of relevance, and the way in which the history of literary study in Russian has made certain ideas visible, and, as Polly points out so interestingly and provocatively, renders certain ideas and figures invisible. In other words, how has our understanding of the 19th century been shaped by the history of our disciplines, and particularly the reception of Slavic studies in the West?
Shall I come in from an art historical perspective there? Without question, any of us working on Russian 19th century art have to deal with the very persistent and problematic Western obsession with the avant-garde, which, you know, I'm stating the obvious here, but it's been around for decades and it still has legs. So it's something which in fact, one of the questions I've had privately in this chat, which is one I often get, is why I finished a book I wrote on the history of painting in Imperial Russia. I very deliberately finished it in 1881, which caused all sorts of raised eyebrows, especially in Russia. But it was because I didn't want in any way to run the risk of this need for avant-garde discourse and avant-garde practice to be included in a history of, or to be dominant in a history of Russian art. I didn't want to run the risk of that overshadowing all the earlier stuff, which was what I was most interested in exploring. I'd actually originally toyed with finishing the book in 1873, which is the date at which Repin finishes his Barge Haulers on the Volga, and it gets exhibited at the World's Fair in Vienna and attracts enormous attention to Russian art. And I rehearsed that idea amongst particularly Russian colleagues who were so appalled at the notion that you could finish in 1873 that I went back to the drawing board, and actually I think they had very good cause to say you need to go further than that. But anyway, I'm just putting it out there that I think we, when we're trying to, about figures being visible and invisible, I'm very, very interested in the agency of figures who have been invisible, not just in terms of recuperating their careers, but what that tells us about much broader cultural, historical, philosophical understanding. And so, yes, back to my point for art historians, the fact that, so often if we say to non-Russianists that we're working on Russian art, then the instant models that appear are those of icon studies or the avant-garde, or indeed later sort of 20th and 21st century work, is I would say, a very significant conceptual hurdle that we have to navigate.
If I might sort of pick up on this, I think for historians, the whole question of how our present situation informs our view of the 19th century is a huge issue. And in that sense, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a bit of a disaster for the 19th century. Because traditionally, like when I was in college and then in graduate school in the 1980s, it was perfectly obvious why the 19th century mattered. Right? The 19th century gave us 1917, and 1917 is why we had everything we had in the 1980s. And so it was perfectly clear what the line was, and therefore it was clear what we had to understand about the 19th century. Right? We never studied the history of the Russian church because that didn't matter. We studied all the weaknesses of the imperial regime, but not the strengths. Minority nationalities weren't important. Bolshevism did matter. So there's a whole agenda for the 19th century that came from where we were. And I think for historians, and this is true not just for Russian historians, it's true for historians of European countries in general, the study of the 19th century has suffered something of a crisis because the post-World War II era has ended. And once the post-World War II era ended, the 19th century origins of the 1920s and 30s and 40s became less significant. And so the 19th century, in a sense, faded. Now, it seems to me that you could find a whole different relevance in the 19th century. And that is the 19th century is a period when Russia and many Western societies were suddenly confronted with problems of modernity and of social disintegration that they'd never experienced before, and had to devise responses to that. So I think if you look at a lot of 19th century thinking and 19th century political ideas, it's about how do you create or sustain order in a rapidly changing society. And that, I think, has all kinds of relevance to the world that we live in today. But it would require a different way of framing the 19th century than to think of the 19th century as the origin of socialism and fascism and liberal modernity and so forth. There's one other thought I wanted to throw in while I have the floor just for a moment. And this is I want to pick up on Luba's really interesting point about why do centuries even matter and should we care? And I think it seems to me that the periodization, where we use centuries or any other period concept, is based on the idea that we're looking at social systems. We're looking at social systems or political systems, and those have a periodicity to them. So the 19th century does reflect something real about social and political systems. I'm currently working on a microhistory about an individual, and what I'm finding there is those temporal divisions don't matter. What matters is this man was born in the 1760s. He had decisive formative experiences in the 1790s, and those echoed in his family down to the 1860s. So there's a line from the 1760s to the 1790s to the 1860s that is transmitted through individual memory. And if you think about it, every human being operates that way. That you have your own memories, you have the vicarious memories of your parents and of your grandparents, and the things that happen in between those moments are of less significance. And so if you construct an image of a society from the bottom up, starting from individual people, the entire conception of historical periodization works differently than if you start from the top down and first look at systems and then just look at individual people as participants in those systems. Thanks.
Yeah, I want to respond to Alex and maybe continue some of these thoughts. One on the kind of irrelevance of the 19th century once the Soviet Union collapsed, and how to think about its relevance. Once again, I think an analogy to what you describe as the kind of as what becomes irrelevant after the Soviet Union for historians is in literary studies is the history of the novel, right? So this idea that the novel is the central genre that we study. The novel is the genre thinking about which we develop our discourse of modernity, right? And a certain kind of disintegration, as the totalization, but also then the disintegration of totalizing narratives, right? Which is certainly a kind of 20th century line of thinking about the novel as the lost epic and so on, right? So to echo some of what you said, I think some of the most fascinating work on the novel that has come out in the past couple of decades has placed the novel amid the noise of ideas, right? A kind of 19th century, what you were describing as the modernity and disintegration, right? A kind of polyvocal world of ideas that, for example, the thick journals present to us, right? That these novels are there side by side with all sorts of other things, that they can be read in a kind of disintegrated way, right? As belonging to different kinds of conversations. So that's one thought on that. And the other one that I had is about microhistories and personal stories. And I often think about writers who live very long lives and who somehow either present themselves as either in sync with their time or radically not in sync and doing their own thing, right? So I'm thinking on the one hand of someone like Zhukovsky or Vyazemsky, right? These two figures who seemed so in sync in the first decade or so of their literary career, and then continue within that paradigm and somehow become increasingly irrelevant, right? This tells us something about periodization, right? And it's non-coincidence with lived periodizations, right? On the other hand, there is, of course, Tolstoy, right? Who you might argue in Russian literary studies as a life, right? From 1828 to 1910 stands for a kind of 19th century, right? Stands for a kind of total narrative of big ideas, big crises, crises of faith, right? And somehow never becomes irrelevant, right? So that's just a couple of asides for that.
All right, so we have quite a few questions, so just so people can keep that in mind. Now I'm gonna call on Jeffrey. I can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. I just published a book about the cultural ecosystem in Russia over 100 years, considering music, art, cultural production on every level of society. And what worries me a little bit about the discussion is it becomes so disciplinary. So my question is, if we consider the cultural phenomena and the political phenomena of the rise of people at many different levels of society who are defining themselves through cultural production, through photographs, through celebrity culture at the end of what some people consider the 19th century, through the production of reading materials and Luba Key at the earlier section, we see a society that is interconnected and mutually engaged at many different levels. And that's what I found exciting in my new book that came out about 6 months ago from Cambridge, The Firebird and the Fox. Russian culture under Tsars and Bolsheviks. And I struggled with the problem of periodization. How was I going to periodize it? And I ended up having it both ways in a certain sense, because when you look at the broad society, I think you can see that some elements seem to close down in the 1880s and 1890s and change. We can end there, but others seem to continue almost seamlessly into the early Soviet era. So my question is, there are many ways to consider the 19th century. What would be the most productive for us as people involved in writing and thinking about Russia over the period? And I think the question about, well, what do we make of the 19th century now that Russia has changed so much? And certainly the argument over tradition and canon and so forth is still a very big issue, whether hidden or not. So that would be my question. I just say that this session is so interesting. I'm pleased to be able to listen in and be part of it. And thanks to Anne for being the brain behind all this. Okay, so I get to wave to you too. That's my question.
I don't know if I've got an answer, but I've certainly got a comment. It seems to me that the excitement and the urgency of work around the 19th century is precisely in the dissonance between what I was calling syncopated centuries. So when we have a periodization which makes beautiful sense when we're looking at a set of material through one prism, and then it falls apart completely when we might, for example, as I have done at times, sort of looked into theatre studies or literature, and suddenly what I had felt was a sensible and defensible chronological framework makes no sense at all. And I think actually that, for me, it's one of the really exciting things about being a cultural historian, that we are not going to reconcile all of those different sort of syncopated rhythms. And what I think is very challenging in what we write is how we recognize that impossibility and nonetheless create something which is readable, which has its own structure in some way, but we don't want to reduce all of those different frameworks down to something that, some sort of monolithic structure.
Well, if I can get in another word, I do cite you several times, Polly, in the book. I can't remember. I have a chapter about Belarus. It may be there. I write about Vrubel, and also I have a chapter on the Periodization, so maybe there too. Anyway, so I think the points are all well taken, and I agree that it's very hard, unless you have an objective that you want to achieve, to decide how to periodize. Maybe that's the issue. So I'll shut up after saying my little bit. But I'll say one thing. I did use a couple of characters that may not be familiar to you, such as the fox, the leading female subversive figure in Russian folk culture, together with the firebird in my book.
All right, and we had a few comments on this topic as well in the chat that I want to bring up before we move on, just to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. So I'll read them both. So a comment from Kate Antonova, follow up to Alex. Other way that the collapse was terrible for the 19th century is that the opening of the archives overwhelmed attention for new directions in Russian history. Secret documents revealed, but there is as much new understanding coming from newly accessible archives about the 19th century. It changes almost everything we thought, which had been shaped by the Cold War as much or more than direct evidence. Much of that archival work does go to recovering non-elite experiences and views. And then we also had a question from Georgi Papashvili. Does it not mean that we historians and other historians are speaking of two different 19th centuries, social real history, including political, military, economic, etc., and cultural, mental history, including arts, literature, religion, etc. Of course, this division is very conditional.
If I could just real quickly say something in response to that. Kate, yes, absolutely, 100%, amen. I sign off on everything you're saying. Georgi, I think I would disagree that we're speaking about two different centuries. My own sense, and maybe that's because I've been spending my time on this microhistory, is I would think of the underlying real reality of the world as being individual people and what those individual people do. And whatever we generalize about systems, right, the more those are higher level complex systems, the more those are really mental constructs that we impose on the reality. And we use them because they're useful for understanding the reality, but they're not the actual reality itself. The actual reality is the individual people. So you might find that for a certain kind of construct, a 19th century from date A to date B is useful. And for a different kind of construct is not useful. And then one should use it or discard it depending on how it works for a particular situation. But I wouldn't think that the history of the individual people and their experience is less real than the history of politics and so forth. In a way, I'd say is more real, because that's the actual raw material, and the rest is our attempt to generalize and interpret about it.
Well, may I add a comment?
Sure, go ahead.
Alexander Martin. I do agree with Luba Golburt that periodization is not very easy to attain, but I think that speaking bottom up, it is essential what kind of human capital formation there is available for individuals. And this in Russia is contingent upon the importation of technology for strategic reasons. So I think that it is not totally beside the point to see two waves. First, the importation of the Baltic fleet that does seep down the knowledge of geometry and numeracy literacy, even to the Serbs, the pre-Peasney Serbs, and then even more, including technology of the railroads during the Nicolaus II. The issue, I believe, that there is some kind of a dialectics among the antichrist veering technology and the rigid structures that are inherited from the serfdom era and that are about obedience of authority. That is, the more human capital is accumulated in the hands of the individuals, the lesser authority will have an impact. And then the special mobility technology of the railroads creates the situation of choice, of transition to rationalism, even spiritual choices, to choose the old believers, to choose the sectarianism, or to choose secularization. And this way, there is a challenge of the Holy Synod, there is a challenge of the structures, and there is an import-export of experiences of different human capitals among the states. So what you describe as an inherited structure from serfdom era, which is quite hierarchical, and novel ideas, enlightenment ideas, seeped in through that is to the nobility. This is not the full picture, because those technologies imported in the service of nobility's hegemony, as a matter of fact, erode the same system. Thank you very much for letting me.
That was a really interesting point. I appreciate your making it. I'll think about it, and thank you for making that point.
Okay, and Emily Wang, if you'd like to speak, you can unmute yourself.
Hey, I'll be brief. Thank you so much to everyone, especially the organizers. This was great. I just wanted to ask about what reconsidering the 19th century means for our consideration of Russian nationalism. So typically sort of the received ideas are that we think of the 18th century as the imperial century, 19th century as the nationalist century, but you know, periodization is complicated, and maybe the way we think about the relationship between imperial thinking and nationalist thinking is also complicated. Maybe there's a way in which, you know, in Russian culture, 19th century Russian culture at least, these two things sort of become elided in a way that maybe they aren't quite as elided in other examples. And what I'm thinking about right now is maybe the ways in which, you know, Pushkin and Stalin, Akhmatova are considered sometimes symbols of Russian national culture, Gogol too, right? And is this something that we can maybe trace back to the 19th century? Anyway, thanks everyone, appreciate it.
Thank you, Emily, for this question. I mean, the kind of obvious thing to say is that the empire doesn't go away in the 19th century, right? It's that these kinds of various kinds of nationalisms are mapped onto kind of in these bigger imperial structures. I've been thinking a lot about this because I've been asked to write an essay for a Cambridge history on Romanticism, which would cover as many Slavic romanticisms as possible in one narrative, right? And so what I ended up coming up with is, okay, what if we just look at the Russian Empire and narrate that story of Romanticism, not as Russian Romanticism, but as Romanticism in the Russian Empire, which, you know, kind of problematically includes Poland, right? Problematically includes Ukraine, but also problematically includes various locations as topoi, right? Sort of at the same time, right? So what if we don't privilege the romantic nationalism narrative first and foremost, but go from the kind of territory that these various romantic writers inhabit. And it still remains to be seen how I might do that. But this kind of thinking is very appealing to me.
All right. And we had a sort of a follow-up question from Jennifer Flaherty. Jennifer, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you to everyone. Also apologies, my dog just started squeaking on her squeak toy, so that is what is in the background. So I wanted to go back to, first of all, I have a follow-up question about the nation state and nationalism. But I was thinking throughout your talks that the divisions of time overlap with these other divisions. So Alex, in your case, class, right? So temporal distinctions are actually, in a sense, class distinctions or state distinctions, you might say, between peasant and elite. And Polly, in your talk, those distinctions are also sort of gendered in a way. So I'm wondering how much, and then Luba, that, you know, I'm thinking that if we're sort of still operating in a sense with the critical categories of the 19th century, you know, are we operating within these categories as well, class, gender, et cetera, in the same kind of way? And so I guess I just have to then kind of bring to the table, you know, an obvious kind of instantiation of that paradigm that, you know, and this again speaks to the question about nationalism that Emily just brought up. You know, if we are still within categories such as the nation state, even if you want to say that that's just a sort of mentality, you know, and if we're still within certain thinkings of class and gender, then, you know, is that the 19th century that is persisting? Is that the temporal model that is really, and then to go back to your point too, Luba, about the personification of the 19th century, right? Like, what does this personification look like? It's class, it's gendered, it's racialized. So I'm thinking too then just how you all, you know, react to, you know, where are we now with, you know, Jameson's idea from the 80s that the only way to think about history in this broad kind of way is to do so in terms of a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, and the only way to sort of have a consistency that at the same time has differences has differences, you know, based on, okay, so here we are in the 21st century, some things are the same, some things are different. The only way to do that consistently, according to him, right, is on the class model. So I just wanted to sort of raise that, which has been touched upon in various ways directly. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you for that. I think, I mean, these are issues which are definitely swirling around in my head as I move for the first time to the sort of Western reaches of the Russian Empire and then across the Baltic Sea. So actually two areas where I don't even have the linguistic skills. So I'm on a very steep uphill trajectory at the moment. But I think what, you know, what I'm thoughtful about is how thinking about your model of the haves and the have-nots, how that becomes problematized in ways I had not anticipated when one moves away from centers into, you know, and I'm using the term very loosely, into peripheries. And I'm, as an example, I've come across an Estonian woman artist who in the 1850s, who one might assume would meet our, to use modern language, would be very much a sort of intersectional woman in today's parlance, by being both from Estonia and being female and trying to make it as an artist. And yet she gets this enormous great grant from Maria Nikolaevna, which enables her to travel abroad and exhibit and achieve all sorts of things which were very difficult for her contemporary men artists to achieve. And so I think it's just, I'm feeding off Luba's point about the empire carries on, even as nationalist sensibilities, trajectories take shape, but also how different bits of the empire enable us to think back towards central narratives very differently. So I just say it's given me a prism I had not anticipated to think about these central ideas about what the, you know, what is it that the 19th century stands for that might distinguish it from the 18th and the 20th.
So that was a really interesting question you raised. I think part of why we use the categories that were created in the 19th century is because we're modern people, and the 19th century invented modernity, and so we do still live in that world, right? We have to operate with, I mean, we can't remove ourselves outside of a system of categories. And all we can do is be careful, I think, about the categories that we use. I don't think anyone's come up with fundamentally better categories than what they had then. So between class and nationality and religious communities, and the thinking of a society as a complex composite of different elements that are continually interacting in some way. To my mind, the big mistake of a lot of 19th century thinkers that I hope we've mostly gotten away from are these grand teleological interpretations that say there's one factor and this one factor drives everything towards some predetermined outcome. And based on that, I would disagree with the idea that class makes sense as a universal basic assumption. I think there's plenty of situations. I mean, if you look around our politics today, right, in both America and Europe, you can see how much of it revolves around conflicts that are not directly about class. And I think you would find that in many moments of the past also. So the important question, it seems to me, is at any given moment, what are the factors that cause groups of people to come together as groups in relation to other groups? And there are moments when that's class, there are moments when it's ethnicity, there's moments when it's gender, there are moments when these things interact in complicated ways.
Thank you for this question, Jenny. I want to bring in another category, one that is kind of closer to my own interests, and that's the category of style. And I think your question has really helped me think about style as something that overlaps with issues of class, right? Where we might, you know, who gets to be described as having a style, right? Yeah. That becomes an interesting question, of course, and also this question of epigonism, right? The kind of you know, the proletariat of perpetuating a certain kind of style, right? So these are interesting to me, but it's also interesting that in literary studies, it seems like style is really on its way out, or has been for a long time, that it's somehow no longer a category with which we responsibly operate, except for maybe in these kind of more popular lectures, right? And class is not, right? And so that's I don't have answers to this, but I think that's an interesting question to pose, right? The kind of non-synchronous waning of categories that can be thought of as in some ways analogous or having roots in similar environments.
May I answer Rosalind Polly Blake? I think that the 19th century, especially the closing decades of the 19th century, in tandem with the industrialization spurt of 1819, as a matter of fact, could be defined as the Bakunian victory, because there is a rejection of the rule of man by man, and it is a rejection of collectivism, compulsory hierarchy, and a perception within the society of the costs of autocracy. And I believe that there is an autonomous association process of forming Zimlaczestwa, wandering Zimlaczestwa, of translating the structures of the village commune as an input to trade union activity, that there is a demand for equality before the law, which, to quote Boyer and Orlan, their theories about institutional change, 1993, there is a translation of material egalitarianism into a demand for equality before the law, the universal suffrage. So this is something I believe unprecedented in Russia, and it is codified in Stolypin land reform. I don't think that Stolypin land reform should be understood as a top-down process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment.
Okay, and Anne Lounsbury, I can unmute you. I'd like to ask a question.
Hi, first of all, thank you for these extraordinarily rich talks. It's really been incredibly stimulating, and the way that they've kind of spoken to each other has been really valuable to me. So this is a question that I first thought of in response to Alex's statement that the 19th century is a time when sort of different systems, almost different temporalities are coexisting. And I think that Luba and Polly made similar comments a little bit more implicitly. And what it made me think about is the fact that 19th century literary texts reflect on this fact quite directly all the time, right? So you get Turgenev, for example, in Smoke, where his main character is in Baden and he gets a letter from his father out in the steppes, and he says, I feel like I turned a corner and I was in the Middle Ages, right? So there's this sense that comes up again and again that they know, these works of literature know that they're living with kind of uneven temporality in a sense. And I had a question for Polly, and maybe for any other art historians who are here. Do you see this kind of reflection in the visual arts as well? Like, is there a sense in painting that sort of the paintings know, or the painter knows, that there's something strange going on with time, periodization, things like that? So thank you very much.
That's a great question, Anne. I think the answer is yes, though I think in rather different ways. And I think there's ways in which you get a sort of pastoral, elegiac sense of nostalgia colliding with very real senses of the today, particularly in sort of genre painters of the 1840s, the 1850s. So I'm thinking about people like Venezianov and his school of artists, where yes, there's a real self-awareness that what they are picturing and what they're engaging with is something which has sort of different modalities, and it is something which can appear to be retrospective at the same time as they're trying to present supposedly present an image of a very modern Russia? So I think it's a brilliant question. And there are some art historians that I know well in this meeting. I don't know if any others would like to comment from different perspectives.
Thank you so much.
Okay. We had a question from Christy Monet. Christy, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I also wanted to thank the Jordan Center for organizing this working group, and also to thank the three speakers for their presentations, which were really insightful. And I'm just kind of thinking of the Russian case as a sort of other or a periphery unto itself, and sort of maybe a meta category of academic studies, especially as it pertains to my field of comparative political theory. And I'm wondering how much work the comparative lens itself is doing when we approach periodization in Russian studies, specifically sort of where the bounds of the 19th century are in Russia. And I was wondering about this in response to Alexander Martin's presentation, because he mentioned the idea of a sort of peculiar nature of the Russian 19th century, that it doesn't seem to fit with the sort of models we have for the US and Western Europe, and sort of the new political, economic, and cultural consolidations we see there in the 19th century, or that we are given to see there in the 19th century as far as bourgeois liberalism goes. But it seems to me that these models are perhaps maybe even too taken for granted in the Western cases as well. I work on 19th century Russian novels and liberal political ideas, political thought, around serfdom and the noble family or noble estate. And of course, I run up against several 20th century Cold War era American political theorists who sort of imagine the 19th century in Russia in sometimes idiosyncratic ways for their own analytic or polemical purposes. But as an observer of American history, I'm also personally often struck by how similar sort of asynchronous planes meet in both Russia and America in regard to persistent regime structures and emergent modern ideas, sort of most reflected in maybe the socio-political predicament of aristocratic landowners, or the economic exploitation of serfed or enslaved labor, assassinations of reform-minded leaders, populist movements from the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. So it doesn't seem to me that even the United States is so much of a clean case of a 19th century break from 18th century old regime thinking and institutions, or it's not as clean a break as it may be projected by some taken for granted models of Western periodization. So maybe those models themselves could maybe stand for some problematizing. Maybe we could, or maybe it might be useful to critically interrogate those comparative models that Russia inevitably runs up against in many different academic fields. And it could even be interesting to see how Russia, as a comparative case, not only demonstrates how periodization is not so neat and clean in the Russian case, but also not neat and clean for cases against which Russia is often compared. So I was wondering, I was just thinking about sort of the comparative lens of methodology and how that might influence how we think about rethinking periodization.
If I might take a shot at responding to that really interesting point. And first of all, you're entirely right. I mean, about that the things that we compare with, when you look at them closely, turn out not to be what we thought they were, right? So I mean, the West, as it's imagined in Russian studies, is some imaginary hybrid of, French democracy and English gradualism and, I don't know, German bureaucracy. It's something that doesn't actually exist in real life, right? It's a mental construct. And it certainly is a problem when people lose sight of that and actually think that that's a real thing. I run into this all the time with undergraduates. They say, well, Russia was like this and the rest of the world was like that. And what they think of as the rest of the world turns out to be, like I said, the sort of hypothetical construct of, based on a synthesis of a couple of countries. So yes, I mean, you're entirely correct. And in fact, I think with most Western countries, I mean, so for this microhistory I'm writing, there's a heavy German component in that. So I'm spending a lot of time studying the Holy Roman Empire. And it's clear to anyone writing about that the Holy Roman Empire is a unique case that's fundamentally different from the West. Whereas from the Russian standpoint, the Germans are part of the West, right? So I think absolutely this comes up every time you look at a place. And that's where I think the creating these comparative constructs is useful in the same way that talking about centuries is useful. That is, if you lay out that this is an ideal type, this is not a literal real thing, this is an ideal type that has some degree of, that matches realities to some degree. And in a particular situation, it has usefulness. So for example, the transition from an old regime society to a basically class society, I think does happen in most Western countries in the 19th century. There are cases clearly where it doesn't, or it only happens in limited ways. So the American South would be a strong example of that. Right, there are cases where it doesn't happen smoothly, but mostly that does happen in a way that it doesn't in Russia. I think for that purpose, you can make a comparison. In other areas, it'd be much harder to make a comparison. So I think the comparisons are useful as long as we're really careful about how we use them and what the degree of usefulness of them is. I think in Russian studies, we make comparisons a lot. I sort of wish sometimes that we got more resonance with the people who work on other places. But that's just my complaint as a Russianist.
Can I echo that completely, Alex? I think, yes, it can be a sort of very fatiguing position to be in. And one of the things I'm interested in doing in my new research is perhaps for a while hypothetically cutting off all links with the artist's idea with all links with Italy and Rome and Paris and London, and stopping ways in which we're ever finding, or people are expecting me to find, frameworks which make sense for them in very alien cultures and places, and actually seeing if there is such a thing as I mentioned briefly in my talk, this idea of a Nordic sensibility. And this where Luba, at some point, I'm definitely going to be begging your expertise in issues of style. And I'm, the essay you're writing on multiple romanticisms in Russia strikes me as a Herculean task. But we are always being considered but our subject matters are being considered in comparative frameworks, which are so often, at best wobbly, and at worst sort of simply have no roots at all. And I'm thinking particularly when there comes this sort of dogged question of maturity, at what point were Russian writers maturing? In what way? Likewise, Russian painters. How did that express itself? I think there's this, this sort of inexorable drive to have it go in a particular direction is extremely unhelpful. I resist these conversations about the maturity of particular schools of cultural production.
Could I throw in something real quick? There's a point I meant to make before and then didn't think of. This is about, Chrissy, this is about your point about Russia and the United States. I'm very much of the opinion that one way you can think of Russia is in relation to the West. And another way that you can think of it is as a periphery of Europe. And in that sense, it's historically in the same boat with the Americas, with both North America and Latin America. And that is to say that there's some of the same forces at work. So for example, you have a largely European, at least elite culture, that gets transplanted into a completely different geographic space, right? If you look at, say, I don't know if you ever come across Kolchin's book comparing American slavery and Russian serfdom, but like if you look at the development of the serf or slave systems in the two countries, you have the fact that you have these countries on the periphery of the European world with very low population density. And therefore, the only way to get a cheap agricultural force to work large land holdings is some kind of servile system. Right? The English can abolish that because they have a very high population density. So there's no problem if you're an English landlord getting people to work your land. For a Russian or an American landowner or a Cuban landowner, that possibility doesn't exist because their space is different. So Russia and the Americas in that way develop along comparable lines. And I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done, but very few people are doing it, to look at Russia and the United States, and I don't think anyone does this, for Russia and Latin America, even though I think there'd be tremendously interesting comparative possibilities to explore.
Yeah, I have noticed that I've noticed a couple of works that do explore especially the sort of 19th century comparisons between America and Russia. And I don't know much about Latin America, but I do, from a comparative political theory standpoint, I do often present the Russian case as a sort of periphery because it's not often included in sort of the Western canon. There's, or if it is, it's through the lens of sort of Cold War political theorist. But I guess to my earlier concern, it's I guess about the switch to a class system in the United States in the 19th century. I guess of course, the South is still aristocratic, but the North is complicit in that as well. And they also depend on that for their industrialization in the same way that sort of Britain depended on so that same exploitation of labor. So, I mean, I see that I see that the class maybe is more emergent in the American case in the 19th century, but I guess I tend to push against making those things sort of such oppositions, sort of the situation in the United States in the 19th century and the situation in Russia in the 19th century. But yeah, that is a lot to think about, I guess.
I just want to make a very quick comment in response to Polly. You kind of mentioned as an aside that Nordic sensibility, and I just wanted to remind us that, of course, at the beginning of the 19th century, there were so many different models of thinking about where Russia was on a map, right? And the kind of the compass of, for example, European literary culture, right? Just one example is Madame de Staël, when she thinks about literature, right? She thinks about the sensibility of the North and the sensibility of the East, right? Where Russia belongs is a big question, because the sensibility of the North is brooding and yet also fundamentally opposed to unfreedom and despotism, right? So it's a kind of English and Scandinavian sensibility pitted against the despotism condoning Eastern literature, right? That revels in the beauty of nature and yet somehow sacrifices its freedom, right? And so where does Russia belong in that? And of course, many of you know Larry Wolf's book about inventing Eastern Europe, how that concept of Eastern Europe itself emerges in that earlier period, right? So it seems like the West is another inheritance that we've received from the 19th century, right? You know, Slavophiles, Westernizers, of course, right, and so on, right? But I think it is helpful to retain some of that variety of partitioning the map, just as it is helpful to retain a variety in our partitioning of the chronology.
There is a comment to Alexander Martin. There is a difference that Kolchin is making among the serfs and the Black people in the US, in that the serfs were organized and were creating the islands of conscious power, to quote Ronald Coase. And this is a Montesquieuian, I think, insulation from despotism. This is on one hand. I do agree with you that Stephen Frank has a large explanatory value, in that this is a system where the elites are actually occupying or colonizing the majority of the population. That in Russia, there was a counterforce which was a priori organized both top down and bottom up. And this posed a credible threat. So there was maybe an incentive to keep this threat under the violence until actually the spatial mobility technology came to, let me say, increase the costs of serfdom, increase the costs of control, because there was a population increase and the land to labor ratio changed, and also population densities, attack Batman Margot, changed, and that is, the serfdom became irrational. So actually, I believe that the structural change, which is also quoted, that is pointed out by Alexander Baikov in Russia, the modernization took off with the spatial mobility technology that could tie the means, that is the natural resources, with population centers, and that could master in Bosserupian way the population increase. So there was some kind of a unintended consequence of the railroads, which I don't think was a formation of class society. It was a formation where the local structures came to translate into abstract modes and pose effective challenge from below, that is effective, credible threat from below of organized uprisings.
Can I jump in for a minute here? I don't know if Alex, if you want to answer that question or not. Usually what happens now after 2 hours is that we finish. Sasha, who is keeping a list of people who have asked to raise questions, says that there's still many people to go. So if, I don't know if the panelists would like to, we could stay chatting about this for another maybe 15 minutes. If, I don't know if anyone has other pressing engagements, such as lunch, or you know, does another 15 minutes sound okay?
Yeah. And what we might even do is maybe bundle some questions. Or partly we could bundle some questions, and partly sometimes questions work as comments also.
Okay.
So it's really interesting to bring up a set of issues and everyone can think about it. And that's separate from whether there's time for the panelists to respond to them.
Mm-hmm.
But that might be a way of doing justice to a significant number of people who'd like to participate.
I agree with Alex. It would be wonderful to hear as many questions as possible without necessarily us answering everything.
I can ask people to speak and give their questions, and then you can respond all at once. So we had, and also can I just remind everyone, if you would like to speak, please send me a note, just so we can make sure that everyone gets a chance to be heard, and I can keep everything in order. So Anne, Margaret, you had a question, and Anne, you had we both had follow-up questions. So if you both want, no, okay. So Anne, you can go ahead.
Sure, it's a question comment, and it's responding to Alex's remark that, you know, in Russian studies, we do a lot of comparing, and sometimes it gets exhausting. And Polly also said that, you know, sometimes it feels almost like unfair that if your focus is Russia, you're constantly being asked to kind of measure what you're studying against these possibly external standards. And I agree. I also think that this comes from a version of peripherality, right? And I think in the end, it's what makes our field more sophisticated, really. And this is, it makes me think of the formalist insight that, you know, all kinds of innovation happens on peripheries, right? People who are on peripheries have to pay attention more closely than other people do. And I'm talking about, as you know, Russians on the periphery, if they feel themselves to be on a cultural periphery of Europe, and also we as people who focus on Russia. Certainly in the West, I think have to be attentive to many things besides Russia. And it's sometimes annoying and burdensome, but I really think it makes us smarter in the big picture. And, you know, many years ago, I wrote a book, was my dissertation, comparative Russian-American book. And one thing that was interesting about its reception was that Russians were very interested and cared about it and read it. It's been translated into Russian now, and Americans didn't really care. Right? Americans didn't need American literature to be compared to Russian literature. So I think that in the long run, it's a strength, I hope, but I've had exactly the same feeling that both of you have had it at certain times. So thank you, and I'll just say one more time, since I won't speak again, thank you so much for all the great questions, and certainly for the panel as well. Thanks.
If I could just say in response to that, I think one reason why we have to do the comparisons in the Russian case is because, now maybe this is implicit in what you were just saying, is because so often the Russians themselves were making the comparison and were responding to it. So you actually don't understand why the Russians are doing what they're doing if you don't understand that they have an idea of an outside world and they're responding to it. And I imagine that your Americanists who aren't reading your book are probably doing that because they have a sense that Russian literature has not affected American literature. If you wrote the same thing about British and American literature, they might be paying attention because they wouldn't know, aha, that's important for us.
I also think, I mean, Anne, I agree with you. For all I was slightly facetiously dismissing too much comparative work, but I do agree wholeheartedly. And the other thing it does is it makes us so much more self-reflective as scholars of our own vantage point, be it privileged or otherwise, or however it might be framed. And this was driven home to me very powerfully when I was working at an artists' colony called Talashkina, which was a sort of, which was inspired by Abramtsova, for those of you who are more familiar with that place. And it's just outside Smolensk. And I went and spent a few days there, and the curator was talking to me about the devastations of the Second World War in that area. And she said, and I remember it vividly, the problem is here we're right in the center of Europe. And I'd been traveling for I can't remember, sort of 2 full days solidly, certainly if I added the bit from Britain, to get there. And I really didn't feel like I was in the center of Europe. And I got home and I tested my own prejudice by looking at a map, and she was absolutely right, pretty much to a pinpoint. Where we were was, but depending on how you define the edge of Europe, it was the center of Europe. So just to say, it drove home to me how important it is that we test on our sense of periphery and center. And I think the same can bring us back to the 19th century. The same can apply to how we consider that century, by constantly coming back to check in on our own vantage point.
Thank you. So we had a comment from Margaret. Comparisons. Our historians constantly make comparisons with the West, which usually means, France in the 19th century. In my own work, I draw parallels with South America, Spain, and the US. And I'll read a few more comments before you respond. From Alice, sorry, I can't tell what your last name is. Russian artists in the 19th century seem to have looked more to Italy than to France, and also to German, Swiss, and perhaps, oddly, Scottish contemporaries. And Lisa, Elizabeth Balconier, writes that Russia and Western Europe, there was an interesting old discussion by a Danish scholar, Brandeis, if I remember his name correctly, which compared Russia to Spain. Okay, and I can move on to more questions unless you'd like to respond, or shall I have some more people submit their questions before get a response from the panel? Okay.
I think those points are very interesting. Taking note of them.
Nikita Bogorov, if you're still here, if you want to ask your question, I can unmute you.
Thank you. Well, I had a question to Polly, but I think she has already addressed it. So it was about if we can still talk about syncopated century in regard to the institutional developments in the Russian art world. So, but I think that in your previous comments, you already addressed it. Thank you.
Okay, and we also had a question from Joseph Bradley. Joseph, I can unmute you. Yep, go ahead.
So my comment is really more in the line of a suggestion that I think might complement the lines of argument that we've been pursuing so far. And that is to think of an exercise. Suppose a Russian is living in 1800 and falls asleep. And then he or she wakes up in 1900. what, if that Russian, he or she looks around, what would be recognizable and what would be unrecognizable? And maybe if we think of what would be unrecognizable to an 1800 person waking up in 1900, that might help us to get at the question of what is really distinctive about the 19th century, however we might periodize it. My own short answer to that is the transformation and expansion of society, which changes from a very small offshoot of court culture around 1800 to something completely unrecognizable. But other people may have other ideas of what would be unrecognizable in 1900, and I think those ideas might get at then what is distinctive about the 19th century. But thank you very much for the presentations and for the seminar.
And we also had a comment in the chat from Ji Chu. This may be a general methodological dilemma, struggle with defining the 19th century to a certain extent because there are different conceptions of 19th centuryness. Why do we need 19th centuryness? Is because we cannot find an accurate and brief term to denote the totality of the complicated and multifaceted social, cultural, political changes which took place in roughly 8 to 12 decades, except an objective measurement of time in a century. In fact, we would like to use another less objective term like modernity, the age of novel, the age of bourgeoisie. However, then we are at the risk of reducing these complicated changes to one side of history, and it cannot capture the totality that we have in mind. Sometimes we use the powerful ruler who has a relatively consistent and far-reaching policy to denote the period. So what I would like to hear, what do you think about the balance between the avoidance of reductive narrative and the reductive tendency in the search for an overarching theme?
I don't have an answer to that. And the reason I know I don't have an answer to that is because in preparation for this, I just set myself an exercise, which is I took a reasonably long piece of writing I've been working on. It's about, I can't remember, it's about 10 to 12,000 words. And I highlighted every single time I used 19th century as a position, a marker, or a description of something. And then I tried to imagine how I could make the points I was trying to make without ever using that language. And I couldn't begin to imagine how I would function without it. And then that made me thoughtful about why it was such a crutch for me, what it was I was so dependent on. So I'm afraid to that question, which I think is a really interesting one, I currently completely draw a blank. And it's one of the reasons I was so keen to take part in this seminar, because I think, I mean, I've had all sorts of ideas tonight, sorry for you, it's my evening, about why we have those dependencies, how we might be reflective of those dependencies, and when we can and can't shed them off. But it's a really interesting exercise. Can I, if for those of us interested in periodization, just give it a go, even with 1,000 words. It's amazing how it highlights the fact that while we like to think we're moving beyond these very sort of hackneyed chronological frameworks, we really struggle to do that, I think, to do it in such a way that it's reflected in what we write and how we speak.
I mean, I think it's also a really interesting question. And I suppose my thought about it is, I think there's a value to accepting that 19th century would be a kind of intuitive concept that we can't really put into other words. So we can't call it the bourgeois era or whatever, but that we have to use something vaguer and hazier. I think there's definitely a place for that. The risk, of course, is that if you rely on a kind of intuitive understanding of what it is, then you can't really articulate to yourself what it means. And so you end up reproducing a traditional conventional wisdom, which might be true, but it might also not be true. And you can't really test whether it's true because you can't articulate what it is. And so I'm sure I use the expression a lot. I've never done that exercise to actually try to go back and check. I'm sure I use it a lot. But I do think that if you can't define what a concept means, it's difficult to use it as an analytical concept.
I think it's, as an exercise, it's been helpful to me to think about where the 19th century, where our use of the 19th century as a kind of crutch, right, conceptual crutch, is easy to do, right? Where the prosthetic leg fits nicely and where it doesn't. And in my current work on poetry, it really somehow doesn't. It's really hard to say, you know, when we say the poetry of the 19th century, what are we saying beyond the kind of, you know, chronology, right? Beyond saying, okay, we're looking at poetry produced in the 1800s, right? What kind of a totalizing narrative can we produce? What kind of an age are we conjuring? And I think it really doesn't work there. But then on the other hand, we do rely on it, right? And so that's what's been troubling me. But I also, like Polly, I'm a little bit at a loss as to how else to work, right? As a literary historian, right? That dedication to historical categories is very difficult to shed and maybe not necessary, right? Maybe we retain them, right? But just to consider that they might not be the best ones, I think is helpful.
Luba, just to say, I find that fascinating, and sorry, I'll be brief. I'm struck by the fact, so within the material I work on, some sorts of painting lend themselves better to the use of this, as you say, Alex, this word which has so many ideas subsumed within it that we can't find an alternative. But for me, so my equivalent of your poetry is portraiture. I think it's when people try and talk about how portraits in 18th and 19th century Russia are grounded within a particular period, they always revert to a description of the person. And they don't, so they find it very hard to move away from the identity of the sitter and consider the actual function of the formal properties of the painting. So yes, my portraiture is similarly elusive, I would say.
Maybe that brings us back to Alex's thinking about these micro-histories and personal histories, right? There's something about personhood in particular, and for my case, a kind of lyricism, right? Or the lyrical tradition in particular that seems to resist those categories.
Yeah. Alex, you have another comment? Go ahead.
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah, I think like Luba earlier talked about, for example, the very long life of Lev Tolstoy, for example. Anything written by Tolstoy, we generally will consider that as a 19th century phenomena. But on the other hand, practically, we also can't really call a work written by Tolstoy after 1900 the work of 19th century. Or if you study, say, the period, if you write a book on a period of, you know, from 1893 to 1917, you also can't entitle the book with something like whichever theme in 19th century. You just can't do it. You also can't say that 20th century. Then
you call it fin de siècle.
Yes, exactly. Then you have to do fin de siècle. Yeah, exactly. But fin de siècle means, you know, it suggests it's 19th century because it's the end of a century. It's not the beginning of another century. So that just, you know, it's something that we just can't settle. I think it just, to me, it just seems like because we have an objective meaning of a century, because it is a measurement of time. Like a minute, hours. When does 2020 begins? It doesn't really begins January 1st, 2020. For some reason it begins in March. For some reason it begins in December 2019. That's just something, the conceptual century and the temporal practical century. Yeah.
I think we need to wrap it up here. So I don't know if that was a really good question and all the panelists responded to it. I don't know if we should go around again and everybody, each of the panelists has some concluding remarks, perhaps. I don't know. What do you think, Alex?
I mean, I probably don't, other than thank you all very much for your interesting questions and interesting comments. And I wanted to thank my fellow panelists and the organizers of this. I found this really interesting and really worthwhile.
And I reiterate that it was such a pleasure to see so many people from my standpoint in Britain and to learn of such interesting work and perspective and ideas. So thank you all very much for staying with us.
Yes, I want to echo that as well and say that also I don't think of myself as a 19th centuryist, even though maybe I am. So it was very nice to see what what 19th century means in terms of our own cohort is this group of people thinking about it. So it was good to see you all, even if in these tiny little portraits. Thank you. And then thank you to the organizers. It was a pleasure.
I would also like to thank everyone for coming. I think it's funny to note how 19V, the name of the group, is now everyone's writing it all the time and reading 19th century. And I personally didn't do that before, but I'm also now writing 19V like it's now a standard term in the field, thanks to this group and to all of you. Thanks to Anne, thanks to Sasha, thanks to the Jordan Center, and come back next week, same time, same station.